Welcome back to Mystery Hour with Nancy Drew. Last night I read a few chapters of The Hidden Staircase, one of my favorites in the Nancy Drew mystery series. We met unscrupulous characters such as Nathan Gambit, who threatened to get even with Nancy Drew's father, Carson Drew, if he wouldn't hand over the papers he demanded. We met other people such as Allie Horner. Let's see what else happens tonight in Nancy's adventures. Will Nathan follow through on his threat to do harm to Nancy's father? Only one way to find out. Let's start reading. Chapter 4. A Second Call. It was nearly 6 o'clock when Nancy Drew reached home after her long tramp. She ate dinner and then waited impatiently for the arrival of her father on the evening train. At last she heard his step on the veranda and ran to meet him. "Well, Nancy, how did you make out while I was gone?" Carson Drew asked as he dropped his briefcase on the table. "Everything go all right?" "Oh, Dad, the meanest old man came to see you." Quickly, Nancy poured out the story of her encounter with Nathan Gambit. Her father listened gravely until she had finished. "So he came here to bother you, did he? I'm sorry you've worried so much about it. Next time, don't let him in." "But, Dad, there's nothing to what he says, is there? You don't owe him any money?" "Not a cent, Nancy." "That's what I thought. But why did he make such a fuss?" "Because he's a natural troublemaker, I guess. You see, some time ago, Gambit's land was condemned for the railroad's right-of-way. I was on the land commission and saw to it that Gambit was well paid. He seemed satisfied with the deal which was made, but after the bridge went up, he began to pester the commission for more money, claimed that the bridge had damaged the rest of his property, and I don't know what all. I didn't pay much attention to his claims because they were ridiculous. He's only a sorehead." "He's been making some ugly threats, Dad. It said he talks about blowing up the bridge." "A man in his right mind won't go around telling things like that," Mr. Drew said with a troubled frown. "I think I'd better keep an eye on him." "You'll be careful, won't you, Dad?" Nancy pleaded. "I'm sure he means to do you harm." "Yes, I'll be cautious," Carson Drew promised. "But I'm not afraid of Nathan Gambit. I know how to handle him. What worries me is the way he came here bothering you. If he should ever try to harm you—" "Oh, I'll probably never see him again," Nancy said lightly. "At least, I hope I never shall." As she spoke, her eyes turned toward the window, and what she saw caused them to dilate in horror. "Oh!" she gasped. "There was someone at the window just then. I saw the face distinctly. It was Nathan Gambit." "You must be mistaken," Carson Drew protested as he, too, glanced toward the window. "No, I'm sure of it, Dad. There's someone on the porch now." Even at that moment, there came a sharp rap on the door. "Don't go," Nancy whispered. "I know it's Nathan Gambit, and I believe he means to harm you. He may have a gun." "I may as well see him now and get it over with, Nancy. I'll not have him snooping around here." Resolutely, Carson Drew walked to the front door and flung it open. The light from the living room revealed Nathan Gambit. "Well," Carson Drew demanded, "what do you want here?" "You know what I want." "What you want and what you may get are two entirely different matters. Come in. I have something to say to you." Mr. Drew permitted the man to enter, but did not offer him a chair. He looked at Nathan Gambit straight in the face. But the man could not return the straightforward gaze. Involuntarily, he lowered his eyes. "Tell me what you mean by coming here and bothering my daughter," Mr. Drew asked curtly. "I just came after my due. Let me tell you something. If you bother Nancy again, I'll turn you over to the police. Get that straight." "I want my rights." "Your rights? What do you mean by rights? You've had more now than you deserve." "You cheated me. My land was worth several times what I paid for it. Either I want the deed back or I want my price." "So you were trying to get the deed when you rummaged in my desk this afternoon?" Mr. Drew demanded severely. "Well, Nathan Gambit, it won't do you a particular of good if you get your hands on it." "What do you mean?" "It has been recorded." "Then I want my price." "Why, you crazy man," Carson Drew snapped with growing impatience. "The commission gave you your price once, and an exorbitant one it was too. If the railroad hadn't wanted your land, you wouldn't have sold it for a dime. The railroad had to have my land. I could have had anything I wanted to ask." "You're mistaken, Mr. Gambit. Charging all the traffic will bear doesn't go any more. Anyway, the bridge could have gone across the river at a point south of your land without costing the railroad a cent more money. You were lucky that they bought your property at any price." "The bridge damaged the rest of my land." Damaged it? Carson Drew smiled. In what way? Well, Nathan Gobbett began to stammer. Then he thought of something. The train scares my horses. How many horses do you have? Why, one. Oh, you have one horse, Mr. Drew smiled broadly, and Nancy could not hold back a giggle. Don't you dare ridicule me, Gombett snorted. I'm not ridiculing you, Mr. Gombett. I am merely trying to bring you to reason. If I recall correctly, your horse is an old nag that couldn't even bat an eye at a train. At all events, your fight is with the railroad and not with me. You drew up the papers. I was merely acting as an agent. I don't care what you say. I know you and your scheming friends are trying to swindle me out of my property. I don't know how you came by such a silly idea. The Land Commission is very fair in all their dealings. What you ask is most unreasonable. As far as I am concerned, the matter is closed. Not much it ain't. I was swindled out of $10,000. Poop! Carson Drew laughed shortly. It is useless for us to talk further, I see. I am convinced you are trying to work a graft, but you've come to the wrong place this time. If you don't give me my money, None of your threats, Mr. Drew cut him off sharply. Now get out of here. Give me my money, not a cent. That's final? Absolutely. Nathan Gobbett faced Carson Drew with clenched fists, and his features were distorted by rage. Nancy, who stood a short distance away, was fearful lest he attack her father, but Mr. Drew showed no signs of flinching, and Gombett was not overburdened with courage. He preferred to obtain his ends by underhand methods. He turned abruptly toward the door, but before reaching it, he wheeled upon Carson Drew again. Nancy thought that he looked like a wild animal making its last stand. Take warning, Carson Drew, he muttered. If I don't get my money, I'll do something desperate. With that, he slammed the door and vanished into the night. Oh, Dad, what did he mean by that? Nancy cried as soon as the door had closed behind the man. I'm afraid he'll do something terrible, perhaps blow up the railroad bridge. I don't believe he'd dare attempt that, Nancy. Nathan Gombett isn't a very courageous man. Then he'll try something underhanded. I know he will. You may be right about that, Nancy. He's obsessed with an idea, and there's no talking him out of it. An idea? I'd call it a mania. Perhaps that's a better word to describe his state of mind. I'm afraid he'll try to harm you, Dad. I'm not afraid of him, Nancy. I know you're not, but he's a tricky sort of enemy to have. Promise me you'll be careful, won't you? I promise, Nancy. Now don't worry about it any more. Nothing will come of that threat, I am sure. Mr. Drew picked up the evening paper and began to read as unconcernedly as though nothing had happened. Nancy found it impossible to follow her father's example. She was dreadfully worried, for she was afraid her father did not consider Nathan Gombett seriously. Oh, how she did hope he would be cautious. Chapter 5. Strange Happenings. With the passing days, nothing more was heard of Nathan Gombett, and Nancy Drew began to grow easier in mind. After all, his threat had been nothing more than bluff, she assured herself. She would probably never see him again. But as she became less vigilant, she could not know that Nathan Gombett was plotting revenge. Happy in her false security, Nancy forgot about the man and turned her thoughts into more pleasant channels. I believe I'll call on Abigail Rowan this afternoon, she told her father one day at the luncheon table. I haven't seen her for months, and I'm curious to know how she is getting along. You'll be back before dark? Oh, yes, I'll be gone only a few hours. As soon as luncheon was over, Nancy backed her blue roadster from the double garage and set off for Abigail Rowan's cottage, which was several miles from River Heights. Approaching the house, she was pleased to observe there had been many changes in the last few months. The former description of the place, the worst-looking house on the road, no longer applied. The cottage had received a fresh coat of white paint, and the shutters were a gay green. The old picket fence had been torn away entirely, as had the old plank wall which led to the house. In its place there was a new one of concrete. The yard was well kept, and at the rear of the cottage Nancy saw a man working in a vegetable garden. I hope I'll find Abigail well, she thought as she parked her roadster and walked toward the house. She rapped firmly upon the door. As she waited for someone to answer the knock, she could not help but recall the first time she had called upon Abigail Rowan. The old woman had been confined to her bed with injuries received from a bad fall, and Nancy had found her in a deplorable condition. There was little food or money with which to buy it, and Abigail had firmly refused medical attention because she could not pay for it. It was through Nancy's instigation that she had received her inheritance from the Crowley estate, and she had wisely devoted a portion of the money to medical service. Nancy's thoughts were cut short as the door was opened by an old woman in a black silk dress. It was Abigail Rowan, and she beamed when she saw her visitor. "Well, I declare, if it isn't Nancy Drew!" she exclaimed with evident pleasure. "Do come in and sit a spell." "How is your hip now?" Nancy inquired solicitous as she followed Miss Rowan. "It ain't hurt me for going on 2 months now. I still limp a bit, but the doctor says I'll get over that. You're looking much better than when I last saw you, and I'm feeling better, too. Things looked mighty black for a while, and I didn't much care for whether I lived or died. I owe you everything." "Oh, not at all," Nancy said quickly. As she entered the living room, she saw that Abigail had another visitor. "Rosemary, we were just speaking about Nancy Drew," Miss Rowan said by the way of introduction. "Well, here she is, one of the finest girls you ever set eyes on." The old woman turned to Nancy. "I want you to meet my friend Rosemary Turnbull. She came over from Cliffwood to see me today." Graciously, Nancy acknowledged the introduction. Rosemary Turnbull was an elderly maiden lady, tall and a trifle too thin, but not at all severe-looking in spite of her clothing. She wore an old-fashioned dress, long and wide of skirt and high in the neck, but she had a kind face, and Nancy was instantly attracted to her. "Nancy is just the girl to help you out of your difficulties, Rosemary," Abigail said significantly. She helped me get my inheritance, and I know she'll help you if you ask her." "Certainly, I'll help anyone I can," Nancy agreed pleasantly. "What is it?" "Well, I hardly know how to tell you," Rosemary Turnbull began. She laughed unsteadily. "It seems I'm living in a haunted house." "A haunted house?" Nancy cried. "Well, of course it isn't really haunted. I don't believe in ghosts and things like that." She lowered her voice. "But the strangest things have been happening lately." "What sort of things?" Nancy asked with interest. "Mostly little things, but after a while they get on your nerves. You see, I live in an old house alone in Cliffwood." "Alone?" Nancy interrupted. "Oh, no. My twin sister Floretta lives with me. Our house, which is generally known as the mansion, was built before the Civil War time, so you can imagine how old it is." She laughed nervously. "A wonderful setting for a ghost story, isn't it?" "Go on," Nancy begged. Floretta and I have lived there for 30 years, and we've never been disturbed until recently. Just the last few weeks, things have been happening which we can't explain. We hear strange noises at night." "In the attic?" "Not exactly. We hear sounds in all parts of the house." "You're sure it isn't mice?" "Oh, mercy! It couldn't be mice or rats." Rosemary was horrified at the thoughts. "Florida and I are very particular about anything like that. There isn't a mouse in our house." "Tell her about the flies," Abigail prompted. "Our house is just filled with them now," Rosemary declared, "and until lately we never had them at all. I can't understand it." "So far your trouble doesn't sound very alarming," Nancy smiled. "And probably there is a screen off someplace?" Rosemary shook her head firmly. "We thought the same, so we made a thorough inspection, and we're very particular to keep the doors and windows closed." "Tell her about the shadows," Abigail encouraged. "We see strange shadows on the wall," Rosemary went on. A note of fear had crept into her voice now. "What sort of shadows?" "Floretta thought she saw a human shadow one night. She's beginning to think the place is haunted. I don't put any stock in that theory, but I'll admit things are beginning to get on my nerves." "That would be enough to get on anyone's nerves," Nancy was sympathetic. "And music! One night last week I distinctly heard someone playing on a stringed instrument. It was enough to set my teeth on edge. Floretta says she'll have a nervous wreck if she stays in the house another week. She didn't want me to leave her alone even for a few hours this afternoon. She wants me to consent to sell the house." "And do you wish to do that?" "No! The mansion has been in the Turnbull family for decades, and you can't blame me for not wanting to turn it over to a stranger. I don't take much stock in ghosts and the like. I can't believe the house is haunted." "Tell her about the spoon," Abigail prompted. "There isn't anything particular to tell. One morning we found a silver spoon missing." "Are you sure it couldn't have been misplaced?" Nancy inquired. "Floretta and I searched everywhere. We didn't think so much until we missed the pocketbook." "You lost a pocketbook too?" "Yes, only yesterday morning we discovered a purse was missing." "This begins to look serious. Was there anything of value in it?" "Nothing except a little money. $8.14, as I remember." "You keep no servants?" "Floretta and I do our own work for years. We have a man to take care of the yard." "How long has he been in your employ?" "Oh, for 8 or 10 years. He's perfectly honest. We know he wouldn't touch a thing. Have you noticed any prowlers about the house? Nancy questioned next. No, I've seen no one except an old organ grinder, and you couldn't class him as a prowler. Still, his monkey might have climbed in a window and taken the articles, Nancy suggested. I only noticed the organ grinder around 2 days, and it wasn't on those days that we missed things. Anyway, all of the windows are screened. Then that theory won't work, Nancy said with a troubled frown. And it doesn't explain the strange shadows on the walls that night, Rosemary added. No, I'm afraid we must look for another explanation. I'm more troubled about the shadows than anything else. It's getting to a point where I don't feel safe to sleep in my own bed. I don't know where it'll all end. Floretta says she won't stay in the house another week if things go on as they have been, and I can't say that I blame her. If only something could be done before it's too late. Nancy will help you, Abigail Rowan declared confidently. You will, won't you? Rosemary pleaded. I don't know whether I can or not, Nancy said doubtfully. I'm tremendously interested in your story, and I'd like to visit the mansion sometime. Oh, when you can come, Rosemary asked. The sooner the better. Nancy glanced thoughtfully at the watch on her wrist. I have my roadster outside. If you wish, I could drive you to your home now and stop there before returning to River Heights. Oh, if you only will. Floretta will be so grateful. I don't like to give up the home, but things are becoming unbearable. I'm sure you can help us. I'll do my best to solve the mystery. Nancy smiled as she arose from her chair. But I'm not in the least confident. I have a suspicion that your ghost isn't going to be very easy to capture. Chapter 3. The Ghost Calls Again. Nancy Drew said goodbye to Abigail Rowan, and after promising to call again soon, left the cottage with Rosemary Turnbull. It's nice of you to offer to take me to the mansion, Rosemary remarked as she stepped into the blue roadster. I came by bus, you know, and it's a slow, tiresome ride that way. Floretta will be delighted to see me back home earlier than I had planned. Is your sister inclined to be nervous? Oh, yes. The slightest thing set her off. She wouldn't stay at the mansion alone at night for anything in the world. I don't wonder she is nervous. So many strange things have happened there. Floretta is certain the mansion is haunted. I keep telling myself I don't believe in ghosts, and I don't. But those shadows, Rosemary shuddered. There's something uncanny about it. From the general conversation, Nancy gathered that Rosemary Turnbull was not the type of woman to be easily frightened. She was eager to visit the old stone house, for she felt that she had encountered a genuine mystery. Have you told anyone about the strange happenings? She inquired presently. Rosemary shook her head. Only the sheriff, and he just sniffed. Seems to think someone was playing a joke on us. Today I asked Abigail Rowan, but otherwise I haven't mentioned it to a soul. You see, I thought that if we should want to sell, the rumor that the house was haunted wouldn't help the sale. Hardly, Nancy replied. But you don't wish to sell, do you? Only as a last resort. Nancy drove rapidly, for the hour was late, and she feared that unless she hurried she would not reach her home before dark. When at last she did reach Cliffwood, it was nearly dusk. Rosemary directed her to the mansion, which was located in an isolated spot on the outskirts of Cliffwood. Through the tall oak and maple trees which partially hid the house from the road, Nancy Drew caught her first glimpse of the house. She was a little startled, for with its 2 large turrets at the front, the Turnbull residence was not unlike a ruined castle. It was a large, massive structure built of white stone, which, with the passing of the decades, had blackened and crumbled. Undoubtedly, in years gone by, it had deserved the title of mansion, but now it could boast little of its glory. With the ebb of the Turnbull fortune, the house had fallen into decay. As Nancy drove up the winding driveway, she could not help but notice the ghost-like shadows which the trees swaying in the breeze cast on the stone walls. A feeling of uneasiness came over her, a sensation which she was at a loss to explain. There's something creepy about the place, she thought. As Rosemary said, it's a perfect habitat for a ghost. Nancy was not superstitious, and certainly did not believe in ghosts, but it seemed to her that the very air about the place was oppressive. Perhaps Rosemary Turnbull had experienced the same sensation, for she turned her eyes toward the second story. I don't see a light in Floretta's room, she observed. I do hope nothing has happened while I have been away. Nancy stopped the roadster in front of the house, and Rosemary alighted. You're coming in, aren't you? She inquired hopefully. Nancy hesitated. I intend to, but it's growing so late. I promised Father I'd be home before dark. It's only a short way to River Heights from here. Floretta will be disappointed if you don't come in for a few minutes at least. I want you to hear her version of the mystery." "I am eager to hear it, too," Nancy declared, switching off the motor. "All right, I'll come in even if it is late. Dad will forgive me, this time." Rosemary lifted her latchkey into the lock and opened the heavy front door. "We've thought it best to keep the house locked the last few weeks," she explained. As Nancy Drew stepped inside, she noticed that the entire house had the appearance of having been built in more opulent times than the present. The rooms were spacious, especially the living room, which was furnished with old-fashioned colonial furniture. The walls were adorned with massive gold-framed portraits, obviously of ancestors of the Turnbull line. As Nancy gazed at the pictures, she realized that once the Turnbulls had been the leading family in Cliffwood. They had been a proud family, but with Rosemary and Floretta the line would die out. Little remained of a fortune which had once been large. Rosemary and Floretta, while not poor, had an income only sufficient for their needs. Yet, because they were the last of the Turnbulls, they were welcome in the best of society. "My great-great-grandfather," Rosemary commented, indicating one of the pictures which had attracted Nancy's interest. "He fought in the Revolution. I'm sure if he were living today, no ghost would dare invade the mansion." And Rosemary smiled slightly. Nancy did not reply, for at that moment an elderly woman came hurrying down the stairway to the living room. In appearance, she closely resembled Rosemary, though she lacked her sister's firm chin. Nancy knew at once that it was Floretta. She saw, too, that something had disturbed the woman, for she was so agitated that she failed to note the presence of a visitor. "Oh, Rosemary," she burst out, "why did you leave me here alone? I know something terrible would happen." "Floretta, you haven't seen anything?" Rosemary demanded shakily. "It's my diamond bar pin. It's gone." "Oh, Floretta, are you sure? Perhaps you misplaced it." "Oh, no, it's gone. I've looked everywhere. What shall I do? I can't bear to lose it." Floretta turned and saw Nancy for the first time. She made a valiant attempt to compose herself. "I beg your pardon," she said somewhat stiffly. Rosemary introduced Nancy Drew and explained that the young girl had offered to help solve the baffling mystery. "Oh, you've come just in time," Floretta declared. "If only you can tell me what became of my bar pin. It was an heirloom. We've had it in the family for years." "When did you last have it?" Nancy asked quietly. "Only this afternoon. I was dressing in my room and was just completing my toilet when I heard the iceman at the back door. I dropped my bar pin on the dresser and hurried downstairs to let him into the kitchen." "Were you gone long?" Nancy interrupted. "Only a few minutes. Not more than 10 at the most. When I came back, my pin was gone." "Are you certain it didn't drop to the floor, or perhaps fall behind the dresser?" "Oh, I've looked everywhere." Floretta sank into a chair and buried her head in her hands. "I'm just sick about it. I wouldn't have lost it for anything in the world." Rosemary went to her sister and tried to comfort her. "We'll find the pin, Floretta. I'm sure it will turn up somewhere." She spoke with confidence, but nevertheless turned uneasy eyes upon Nancy. "Perhaps a bird flew in at an open window and took the pin," Nancy suggested. "Oh, I'm sure that couldn't have happened," Floretta insisted, "but if you'd like to see the room, I'll be glad to show it to you." She led the way up the narrow circular stairs, and Nancy and Rosemary followed. Floretta's room was in the east wing. "Is this the top floor?" Nancy questioned. "The attic is above," Rosemary responded. She attempted to smile. "There's no ghost up there, though. I know, because I looked myself." Floretta's room was small. Nancy noticed that it had only one door which opened into the hall. There were 2 windows, both screened. "I left the pin right here," Floretta said, indicating the dressing table. "A bird couldn't have taken it." "I see now," Nancy said quietly. She crossed the room and examined the screens carefully. Apparently they had not been touched, for an accumulation of dust was undisturbed. "I know someone entered my room while I was talking with the iceman," Floretta declared firmly. "Oh, I don't want to stay in this horrible house another night." "It's apparent no one entered by means of the windows," Nancy said quietly. "Tell me, from where you stood in the kitchen, could you see the stairway?" "Why, I could have, if I had looked, I suppose. The kitchen door was open." "You saw no one go up the stairs?" "Not a soul, but someone might have entered the house when I had my back turned." "Weren't the doors locked?" "Yes, I had forgotten that. And if anyone had gone up those stairs, wouldn't you have heard them?" "I think I would have," Floretta admitted. "The stairs are old and they creak." Then how did the thief get in? Rosemary cried. Floretta's bar pin couldn't have walked off by itself. I wish I could tell you what became of the pin, but I can't, Nancy said regretfully. I'm as puzzled as you are. As she spoke, she turned and for the first time noticed a closet door. Was it possible that the thief had entered the house early in the day and had hidden in the closet, biding an opportune time to snatch the pin? Floretta divined Nancy's thought, and a look of horror came over her face. Oh, you don't suppose someone has been spying on us? She demanded fearfully. I never once thought of the closet. What if there's someone in there now? Rosemary laughed nervously. Don't be silly, Floretta. However, she eyed the closet with misgiving and made no effort to investigate. Just to make sure there's no one inside, I'll have a look, Nancy remarked. She crossed the room and paused before the closet door. Hesitating only an instant, she jerked it open. All right, do you think there's anything in the closet? Was someone spying on Floretta Turnbull, waiting to grab the pin? Tune in tomorrow night, 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, to find out what happens. See you guys later.